without further ado, I'd like to invite up the first speaker of Youth Forum to stand with us.
Oh, why am I seeing myself? Am I? I can't tell. It's disgusting anyway.
Oh, do you want me to switch to that?
Oh no, I literally don't mind.
Now we can.
So many papers. What in the world? That's stupid. The New Zealand economy is currently premised on a comparative advantage that is on its way to failing us in the future. Dairy and agriculture rely on an unstable and unpredictable environment that's probably going to fail. I think it's at some point we need to become more self-sustaining. I think this is the way to do it. It's time to do it now. 2 points for the House. Firstly, about why New Zealand is too dependent on other countries. Second, on why the New Zealand comparative advantage is inefficient. But before that, some setup. Firstly, on our model, what we're going to say is we're going to look at, New Zealand is going to look at other major goods that we import from other countries. This looks like EVs that we import from China. This looks like clothing that we import from Southeast Asia. This looks like other tech such as farming equipment that we are reliant on in our economy. And then what we say we're going to do is we're going to subsidize those industries and implement protectionist measures. Second point on setup though is about why these industries are likely to succeed. First is that we have a very educated population who keep leaving our country, right? Note then that when we subsidize these industries, there are incentives for people to stay. That means that these companies are now able to provide benefits for their employees that mean that these individuals who study computer science, for example, are no longer going to be willing to leave our country. That's the point at which we're able to get success. But secondly, no, we just have a very skilled middle class that are able to do things. I think these industries are likely to succeed. So then, why is New Zealand too dependent on other countries? The context of this point is that New Zealand is a nation heavily reliant on imports. This looks like clothing and how we import a significant amount of our clothing. This looks like how we import a significant amount of all our technology, for example. Note that a majority of these goods do come from China. That it's like around 80% of all our imported goods. I think that's the point at which we have to contend with that. So why is this risky? First is that China is likely to go into an economic crisis. This is for 3 reasons. First is that China is currently in a housing crisis. It means that individuals within China are likely to fail and just not have enough money to go to their work, for example, unlikely to be able to succeed in a cost of living. I think that's the point at which our clothing is dependent on Chinese people being able to go to work, being able to succeed. That's the point at which if China fails, we're going to also fail too. The second thing is that the manufacturing sector is likely to collapse. This is for 2 reasons. First is that the cost of living is rising in China. It means that we're going to it means that manufacturing is going to be more difficult. It means that we won't be able to rely on Chinese imports for very long. Secondly, is that the demographics are also getting very old. That is to say that these individuals are getting older in general. They're also not able to produce as highly. I think that's the point at which we're more dependent. But third is that there is a trade war going on between China and the United States. What this means is that China is trying to get into tech, but the United States is locking it out. I think that's the point at which we have a trade war. It means that the Chinese economy is likely to be more risky. The second reason why it's risky then is that New Zealand is locked into trade with China, right? That means that it's more difficult to find other countries to import clothing, for example, because China does have a very large part of clothing manufacturing. Noting that this raises the cost of living, the point at which Chinese goods, we are dependent on Chinese goods being inexpensive, I think that's really important. What benefits do we get then by being more self-sufficient? First is that we get more jobs. What this means is that many individuals who work in high-skilled areas are likely leaving our country because New Zealand isn't able to have those industries be it locally. That looks like the tech sector where a lot of individuals are leaving our country because New Zealand isn't able to subsidize those industries. The point at which we get more subsidization of those industries is the point at which we have individuals wanting to come. We have more jobs for these individuals, the point at which we have things like manufacturing for clothing. I think that's the point at which we just get more jobs for these individuals. But secondly is that it stimulates the local economy. What this means is that we're not reliant on outside countries to have a functioning economy. The point at which our spending remains ourselves and we're not actually importing a lot of goods and sending money out of our country. I think that's the point at which we actually have a better local economy. 2 impacts then. Firstly, the New Zealand economy is benefited. Firstly, on the point of just that we're more self-sufficient, that's the point at which we do have more jobs that mean people get fed, for example. It means that we're not risking other countries having this like having leverage over our nation. Overall, I think it means that we have greater spending internally. It means we're not spending money outside of the country. It means that we actually have a lot more money within our nation to be able to spend on this things like food, like going into warm homes. I think that's really important. But second, there's a significant risk of economic collapse. What this means is that on their side of the house, what we get a New Zealand that is dependent on other countries. It is dependent on countries like China, which are likely to fail. I think that's the point at which cost of living increases significantly in New Zealand, the point at which other countries are actively failing. That means that New Zealand aren't able to get goods that we necessarily rely on. Once we're able to become more self-sufficient on that front, the risk of that is significantly lowered. How would you weigh this point then? First is about the scale of harm. Let's note then that everyone in New Zealand is benefited, the point at which we have a more self-sustained economy, because it means that everyone is able to just spend more freely. But secondly, note then the severity of harm of like the risk of potential collapse that's the point at which we would like to care more about this point. Even if the risk is like marginal, we have explained why China is likely to collapse. That's the point at which we are likely to see the cost of living within New Zealand increase drastically. I think this point is really important. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Okay, so countries like India and China have much lower costs of production. This looks like, wages and access to resources. So subsidies would have to be massive for New Zealand businesses to compete. Why should we spend the money on these subsidies when it's not feasible in the long term, when we could solve other problems?
Okay, I think being able to put money into this increases stability. I don't think the costs are going to be significantly greater. Honestly, the risk of increased costs is significantly greater the moment China collapses. Honestly, when we aren't able to import clothes at all, I think it's worth the risk of being able to start producing on our own. Okay, why is the New Zealand comparative advantage inefficient then? The context of this point is that the New Zealand comparative advantage exists only in the field of agriculture. This looks like sheep, this looks like dairy, that's the only places it exists. What they necessarily need to support is putting all their efforts into these industries. I think that's bad. Why is it inefficient then? 3 reasons. First is that the New Zealand's economy is dependent on external supply chains. This looks like how we need a lot of farming equipment in order to actually run our industry. We need a lot of milking equipment to actually be able to start our dairy industry. The point at which we're dependent on external supply chains means that our own comparative advantage is significantly weaker, the point at which we have to depend on other nations. Secondly, though, is that climate change will destroy agriculture. Note then that climate is significantly getting worse. Our industry of agriculture is dependent on having a reasonable climate. That means that we're actually able to reap the benefits of our comparative advantage. Note then that running things like dairy farms is a self-fulfilling cycle that actively destroys the climate. I think the point at which our only industry is actively killing its own ability to actually produce, that's incredibly damaging. It means in the long term, it's significantly more likely to fail in the long term. Thirdly then is that the world is trending towards a state of protectionism. What this means that a lot of countries are no longer looking to accept imports from other countries. I think a majority of countries are becoming more protectionist. I think the point at which we're unable to export our meat products, the point at which we're unable to export our dairy products to South Asia, I think that's the point at which our industry is likely to fail. 2 impacts on this then. First is that there's going to be very large long-term harms. What this looks like is it looks like how our dairy industry is likely to fail in the future. I think that's the point at which our whole economy starts to crumble, the point at which a majority of these individuals who work in this industry need to leave their jobs. I think that's the point at which these individuals struggle to make ends meet, the point at which the very premise of their economy, the very way they actually earn money starts to fail. Right? Note then that we probably have a lot of short-term success in this industry, regardless of whether or not we actually put effort into it. That is, that our agriculture sector is probably going to succeed in the short term. The point there is that the long-term success is very short. The point at which we get huge harms in the long term, I think that's really damaging. The second, though, is that there is a big risk of collapse. That is, the climate is getting worse. We are very dependent on external supply chains. That means that the agriculture industry is likely to fail. I think it's really important that we diversify and are able to actually have a lot of industries elsewhere that act as a support network for individuals. 2 points to weigh in this point. First is that I think it's very likely that it is going to happen in the future. That is because climate change is damaging, agriculture is likely to fail. I think it also affects the most vulnerable insofar as farmers and those individuals are very vulnerable individuals in society. The point at which they fail, they're kind of screwed. Very proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd now like to invite up the first speaker on the debate.
When we support efficiency-oriented economic policy, we utilise our natural competitive advantages in our New Zealand situation to help our own people while taking down trade barriers to expand our New Zealand market and compete on an international scale. So 4 things in today's speech. Firstly, on some quick responses. Secondly, on setup. Thirdly, how efficiency-oriented policy helps New Zealand grow. And then finally, why New Zealand is not vulnerable to any economic shocks. Luca will give a split on how we increase consumer confidence. So firstly, on some quick responses, but I have a lot of integrated rebuttal, which I'll try flag if I remember. So firstly, on responses. So we heard that New Zealand is dependent on all these external supplies because we need like farming equipment. So note that this stuff is like a one-time cost thing. We broadly already have the equipment because we can see this by the fact that we have such a big farming and agriculture industry already. Like we already have all of these imports that are required, but I will get into later why we can become more independent when I move into my speech. But secondly, on this push that climate change destroys agriculture. So firstly, this is so far away, so it's just largely not relevant to this current situation where the debate sits. Secondly, they never told us how this directly crumples at the agriculture industry in New Zealand. But thirdly, we're not actually like near the equator. We don't think this will have too much effect on us. But moving on to some setup. What are efficiency-oriented policies? Firstly, it looks like lowering barriers to trade and investment. So this could be A, establishing free trade agreements, B, repealing sanctions and tariffs, or C, less regulations on overseas investment. Secondly, it looks like removing regulations that impede competition. This could be A, allowing international companies to be more present in New Zealand. So this means less subsidies in New Zealand domestic businesses. Like, this means that a clothing company in China, which has cheaper products, is better able to compete in New Zealand. Or B, domestically, we have less strict product standards, which we think allows more startup businesses, which I'll talk more on in my first point. What does resilience-orientated policy look like? Firstly, it's subsidizing domestic production. So this looks like giving local companies money as an incentive for them to lower their prices and produce more. Secondly, it's restricting trade of key technology with adversaries. So this looks like being cautious about selling unique New Zealand products to prevent international competition. Note that this does come at the cost of international revenue and this net trade revenue. Thirdly, we're building national resources. So putting money aside, this looks like a national savings account where we just let this money sit. 2 ways we can win the debate. Firstly, we improve the lives of New Zealanders when we implement these efficiency-oriented economic policies. Or secondly, we provide a better platform for potential economic growth. So moving on to my first point on how efficiency-oriented policy helps New Zealand growth. Why is New Zealand uniquely vulnerable at the moment? Firstly, we have this huge national debt. Like, when we had this Labour government in place, we did have the COVID-19 epidemic happening. This did mean we spent a lot of money. I believe it was like the most spending in like 10 years or something. Secondly, this huge unemployment crisis. Like, we've had this huge cyclical unemployment crisis since COVID happened, when we have had this big downturn in economic activity domestically. Thirdly, there is no capacity for the government to be investing in public goods because they don't have that much money. This is why National and ACT are trying to cut back on public services. So how do these policies stimulate the economy? Firstly, we just have more resources coming in because there are less restrictions on trade, so people are going to be buying more overseas resources. So businesses now have the unique capacity on our side of the house to grow. This means A, supply chains strengthen, we get more regular and stronger income of goods, and B, this gives local industries the capacity to manufacture more and potentially become independent. Secondly, people have access to new things. Imports increase and therefore become more cheap because we are importing in like bulk. So people have access to new things that New Zealand doesn't actually manufacture. This means things like cars that we don't manufacture in New Zealand are now way more affordable for the average citizen. Thirdly, it's easier for new businesses to grow. This is because we have less restrictive standards which can now compete more on price with like companies that are monopolies, like a local supermarket can now compete with New World or Pack and Save. So businesses grow. This is really important. But to further this, New Zealand has comparative advantage in what are already our own key industries. This looks like dairy and like animal products. Secondly, tourism, and then finally agriculture. We already have good working conditions and can implement these systems efficiently and make profit off them. So now, by removing these trade barriers, we help implement new industries and improve these industries on an international scale, but we can still grow more domestically. So what does this mean? Firstly, we get more trade. At our worst, this means we get necessities for cheaper. We increase the quality of life. This looks like people being able to get like healthier, unique food from like Beijing and like new medicines from China. That could like potentially save lives, and now they have extra money in their pocket that they can potentially use to afford more education. But on the higher end of the spectrum, they now have the ability to save more money because they aren't spending so much. So now they're individually secure if there was an economic shock in the future. But secondly, like domestic industries now grow because we have more resources and less restrictions. This means they can expand, they can branch out, they can put new initiatives in place, they can upscale on a huge platform, which means A, they hire more people, which is really important because we get less unemployment, and B, they have the capacity to pay their employees more to incentivize a higher quality of productivity. This is really important because unemployed people are very vulnerable, right? Often this leads to things like taking loans or like sitting on the benefit or having to take loans from friends, which are all unreliable and often lead to like loan traps and debt traps. So now they have the ability to get jobs, and note that this could be in a low skill area for these people who have been unemployed, but could also be in high skilled careers for people who have been working for a while and now can like support themselves and get a house. Secondly, the government has more money, and at our worst, all of these new employees are like paying tax, and like the government has more capacity to invest in public goods, but we think it's likely that they generate more revenue from this domestic growth as a whole, and are now able to like pay off that debt that is so significant and has been like overshadowing how our government is acting, and now can invest in public services, which means like your average Joe is able to like just have the capacity to act more and be more free. Yeah, I'll take a POI really quickly.
Yeah, so how are New Zealand industries going to grow when everyone's going to buy from external countries which you say are cheaper?
Because we told you that we reduce these domestic restrictions that are in place, and we have the capacity to strengthen those supply chains, meaning we get more resources in, and companies who like manufacture in New Zealand but get parts from overseas are able to manufacture more products and employ more people. This means that they can sell more goods, and we grow domestically as a country. So the context for the second point on how we increase consumer confidence is that New Zealand is an island country. So historically, we've had to like be self-reliant. This means we've had things like food, water, and energy all produced, and like even things like international markets like the dairy industry competing internationally. Because it's risky to rely on other countries that you don't have borders right next to, because A, supplies come via shipping, which is never really a certain thing, and B, there's like no direct accountability of like war. Even if you believe, and in response to the point about China, even if you believe that we are fully reliant on China for technology and clothing, these aren't so essential that we are unable to cope without them. Like, we do have the capacity to reduce clothing, to reuse clothing, and B, like most people already have things like phones and technology that already work, but we actually aren't reliant on China because one, we have things like India, Indonesia, and Pakistan, who are all big clothing producers and have like these low costs as well. This isn't unique to China. And secondly, at the worst case, we still do make some clothes, but this is like the worst case, right? So what does New Zealand uniquely have? Firstly, we provide our own food and energy. Secondly, we can have unique competitive advantages in the agriculture industry. This means we can be independent, and economic shock isn't going to have the impact that Aff will claim.
Thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite up the second speaker, please.
let's just cut through everything. If we're able to prove that New Zealand's dairy industry sucks, we win this debate. Because what these guys have to do is prove to you why New Zealand's dairy industry is so good that we're going to be able to fully be reliant on it. Because New Zealand doesn't have a comparative advantage in anything else. All we have is dairy. If that isn't good enough, then they have to instantly lose out on this debate. So, a couple things in the speech. First, I'm giving you a split on brain drain. Secondly, I'm just generally going to talk to you about why dairy industries suck. And then I'm going to talk to you about cheaper imports and mitigate their material on that. And then I'm going to talk about who has better economic growth overall. So, firstly, on brain drain. Right now, we have a lot of brain drain because we have a lot of skilled workers, but they aren't able to get that much pay in New Zealand, so they go overseas. Like, this is just a fact. I don't want Luca to respond to this because obviously every New Zealander knows that this is incredibly true. So, on our side, we're able to subsidize firms. What those firms can do is give their workers money to go ahead and stay in New Zealand, or provide them things like benefits for them to stay in New Zealand. Note, even if we're able to not get as much pay overseas, people generally still want to, people still have some incentives to stay in New Zealand, such as the fact that it's a culture they're familiar with, such as the fact they have friends and family there. That now we're able to get the tipping point for them to prioritize those incentives over a potentially small increase in pay. So, what are the impacts? So, what that means is we have less brain drain. What are the impacts of this? Twofold. Firstly, less people being an economic burden on New Zealand. We spend a lot of money on people's education, and then they just go overseas and they don't do any of the work for them to make up for that. They also don't do things like take care of their grandparents. So the government and state needs to do that, which means more spending on pensions. So this is like just a bunch of money wasted, right? I want to be very clear on this. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Governments constantly worry about things like pensions, constantly worry about brain drain. It is a massive thing that hurts these economies. On our side, we're able to stay and get all of that money. Secondly, is that now these skilled, valuable services are in New Zealand. We have those engineers to help improve our infrastructure. They're far more likely to go ahead and stay in our country. So what that means is that we get a big benefit from having more people just stay in New Zealand. So, now then, let's talk about why agriculture sucks. So, the first thing I want to note is that it's going to have an incredibly oversaturated labor market. Note, this is because the dairy industry is not likely to grow for two main reasons. Firstly, is there's not likely to be that much FDI, because you don't want to develop a fully developed industry like New Zealand. We already have an incredibly developed dairy industry. What that means is you're not going to get that much ROI. You generally want to invest in something smaller because you're going to get bigger returns on that. Secondly, is that people move away from dairy as the economy develops. Because dairy is low-skilled work, right? Like farming is low-skilled. And when your country develops and urbanizes, you need more pay to keep up with that because that's an increased cost in living. That means you need to transition towards higher-skilled work, which isn't in the dairy industry. So the dairy industry can't grow because of that. So everyone is reliant on the dairy industry. What the problem is that it's not an industry that's growing, right? It's not going to be that many new jobs in there. So that means that the labor market is going to be incredibly oversaturated. That means you're very easy to replace. So you give your employees incredibly low pay. So that means lower pay for your employees. That means a lot of people just aren't likely to be employed because those jobs aren't there. Comparatively, we have more labor markets out there. We have more jobs that you're going to be able to go ahead and enter because we're going to be developing those more on our side of the house. The next thing I want to say is the dairy industry is just incredibly vulnerable to climate change. So the thing is here is that eventually we just have to decrease methane emissions. Now, note, these emissions are a small part of climate change emissions as a whole. That's what they're going to say. The issue is that everything, all forms of carbon emissions are just like all small parts, right? So everything is a small part. Everything is a small thing contributing to the big problem of climate change. So therefore, then you just need to go away at those small parts. You can't just keep on letting countries just get away with doing small contributions to climate change. You need to crack down on all of them. So that means a lot of countries probably just aren't going to let New Zealand get away with big methane and producing industries. They're just not likely to buy our products. And New Zealanders just generally have a large care about climate change. Just being environmentally friendly is generally a big part of New Zealand culture, which means that there are going to be incentives for us to not go too heavy into the dairy industry. What this means is the dairy industry is likely to become a lot smaller because we're going to need to decrease output. We can't have 4 sheep for 1 New Zealander because that's just going to be too much methane being produced. So that means they need to decrease output from these industries. Companies want to keep their profit margins, and when you're selling this stuff but keeping the same labor costs, that's bad. So therefore, you lay off a bunch of people, and therefore you instead lay off a bunch of people. And since New Zealand is only reliant on that industry, that's a particularly bad thing. So next, I want to talk about who's able to grow industries better. We're able to grow our industries for two main reasons. Firstly, is that we're able to grow it better through the domestic market. We're able to hire people into these high-skilled sectors, i.e., into tech sectors, where they get a lot of money, and therefore they're able to since these people have a lot of money, therefore they're able to buy more goods, right? We're able to buy more domestic goods in New Zealand, which means more profits for those companies, meaning those are able to grow more. But secondly, is that they don't get out-competed by companies with big economies of scale. And here's what really rebuts the case, right? Because they just assume New Zealand can grow on its own. But New Zealand doesn't have that comparative advantage. New Zealand is small, especially in comparison to things like the US and China. These countries have far larger companies than New Zealand, far larger economies of scale, which means that they're always able to outcompete the companies on their side. So all you literally have is dairy. You can't go into other sectors on their side. On our side, we get subsidies. We can tariff them. We can limit these companies from entering the country, which means that you're not able to grow your industries, which means that we're able to grow these industries as a whole. Meanwhile, these guys are stagnant. Let's talk about subsidies, because they talked about how we're going to have a lot of big government spending. I think there are two ways in which we're able to get economic growth. Firstly, we have more growing industries. We have these growing tech sectors. That means we're able to employ more people, and since this is quite high-skilled work, that means a lot of tax income, which that means a lot more tax income. We're also able to get more corporate tax. Note the more industries grow, the more economies of scale they have, the less they get competed, which means the less subsidy spending they go overall. Secondly, I told you as to why we have less brain drain on our side, which leads to more money for New Zealand as a whole. Before moving on, I'll take point.
Look, the reason engineers go overseas is because we don't have a developed engineering industry in New Zealand. Regulations that impede domestic industries exist on your side of the house. How will businesses have the capacity for these engineers with this restrictive growth?
You know what? So let's imagine this, right? New Zealand tries to start its own engineering company. Now it has to compete against all of those other very, very massive engineering companies completely left by itself because they have no support on their side. They have no economies of scale. All of the other companies have far more money than them, can charge way lower prices than them. They can literally just never compete against them. That's the comparative there. So fine. So what that means then is that that money isn't going to be that. Either we don't lose that much money on our side due to these subsidies, or we get more money overall from these growing industries. Finally, I just quickly want to mitigate some of this stuff on importing goods. So what we told you is that China is likely to go down, which wasn't responded to from Ollie. No, China is uniquely good at manufacturing, right? It already has a lot of set up, developed facilities there. Things that Indonesia and these other Southeast Asian countries don't have because they didn't have as much of a chance to develop and haven't gotten as much FDI as China, which means that they're worse at manufacturing. So that means your imports aren't actually going to be that much cheaper. So overall, yeah.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd now like to invite the second speaker for the decision.
Whose credit card is it? Wait, is it anyone in this room?
Oh, what the hell? I think right now.
Bribery scandal.
Now you have to give us the win, Jamie. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't think I lost.
Economic policy always comes with a trade-off. When you want to prioritize resilience, when you want to prioritize investment that helps you for future shocks, you inherently have to sacrifice short-term gains. But what we give you is short-term gains that actually get us out of cycles that our country has been trapped in, that get us out of cycles that have led to unemployment, that have led to businesses not being able to grow, and that is how we provide the best for the people in our country. I have 2 points of class to touch on in this speech. Firstly, on economic growth, and that is where I will deliver my substantive contribution. Then secondly, on dependency. So on economic growth, I'll start with my substantive contribution. This is a split point on how we increase consumer confidence. The context is that the incentive on people to spend money is that you want them to have the perception that the economy is doing well. This looks like firstly being told in the media that the economy is good right now, like a national saying we're going to rebuild the economy. Secondly, being told or perceiving that the economy is like on an upwards trend, like being told that the inflation rates are stabilizing, or thirdly, a change from existing systems that have been worsening the economy, right? Like people have some hope that like some change from the status quo, regardless of what it is, will be better. Why is this? Because people don't want to buy things if they think there might be economic shocks in the future, because they want to save for those hard times to make sure that they have the money to like survive in those harder times, but also because they're waiting for prices to come down, so they don't make big purchases. They don't like go out and buy a new washing machine or a new car until like they think the economy is going to be doing better. So then how does efficiency-oriented policy make consumers more confident and make them spend more? Because firstly, it focuses on positive narratives. It's this idea of growth rather than the focus on like defending against these scary negative harms that then get in these people's heads. This means consumers don't think about those potential shocks as much and they're more likely to spend. But secondly, because it shifts away from past strategies. For example, the Labour government had to focus on resilience-based policies because of COVID. We tell you that that's like a one-time thing that's unlikely to happen again because we've built up the procedures to defend against it. We have like the vaccines, right? But people still associate their job losses, people still associate the prices rising with those resilience-based policies because they happened at the same time. When we change like our policy direction rapidly, we shift away from these narratives. That's why National and ACT were able to win this most recent election, because it told people that we're going to make a change and people had hope that that change would be better. What does this mean? It means that people spend more money because they're more confident in the economy. This means that firstly, we get healthier inflation cycles that are stable. This looks like people buying more, which means companies grow because like they're getting more money into there. That means they're able to hire more workers because they're going and like establishing a new business in like a new town, or they're like starting up new initiatives. This means more jobs. Ollie told you why that was really good. It also looks like being able to pay your workers higher wages. This then leads to prices going up and you get that really healthy inflation cycle. Ollie told you why this was crucial for jobs. Secondly, it prevents harmful deflation cycles, which is like the reverse of that, where people don't buy, companies then lower their prices because they don't have enough money, but they're making less money, they then have to lay off workers and decrease wages, which we tell you is really bad. This is a cycle because then like people keep waiting for those prices to go down and they never do, which means like, or they keep waiting and then like they keep going down and they keep waiting and they keep going down, which means that like the lower deflation gets, the less like we're able to fix that with things like central banks, and that is really harmful. Why is this so impactful? Because we tell you that like less unemployment and higher wages is really, really like a salient issue. Because like at the basic level, it means that like when people have jobs, when they have a stable income, they're able to afford more things that get them a better quality of life. This also extends to the material that Ollie gave you about like things being just broadly cheaper when you buy them from like much cheaper overseas industries, rather than like really expensive domestic businesses that just simply can't compete. What that means is then you're able to afford things like better healthcare. You're able to afford like healthier diet. You're able to afford to send your children to university when you couldn't before. It also means that in case of a crisis, you have money saved, you have that security. If you end up losing your job, because you're less likely to lose your job because there are more jobs available. But if you do, now that things are cheaper and you were being paid higher wages when you did have that job, you're now able to feed your family better. You're now able to pay for things like healthcare, like really expensive medicines and things like that. And you're not reliant on things like loan traps. In the worst case, it looks like in our best case, it looks like us reducing homelessness, which is like a really harmful problem when people get stuck in these situations where they're unemployed and they just simply can't get a job. On our side, we increase the amount of jobs because we increase the industry. That's really important. We also tell you that when we are bringing more money into the economy through these efficiency-based policies, the government just simply has more money to spend on public services, and this is really beneficial, right? Because it can spend it on things that help the most vulnerable people in our country. It can implement policies that give free food for children in schools that need it, and that is where we win this debate, by helping those most vulnerable. That's what we're unable to do at the moment in this country because we don't have that money coming in. We don't have enough of it to spend. I'll take a PY before I move on.
What you guys need to defend is trying to put all your efforts on agriculture while letting other countries flood in and destroy our economies. How do you actually grow industry?
I'll explain to you why agriculture isn't our only comparative advantage in this next point of clash on dependency. So I'll firstly talk about I'll start with that in terms of industries that we can domestically compete in. They tell us that it's only agriculture. Why is that not true? Because we have agriculture firstly is not just dairy. When they characterize agriculture, they characterize it just as dairy. We have a lot of other branches of agriculture, like other kinds of food, other crops that we make. But we also have an extremely large tourism industry, which brings us in a lot of money. We're a very nice natural country with lots of good landmarks and it's quite a safe country as well. It's a popular place for tourism. Also, we have a large service economy, and then we provide a lot of services and a lot of energy as well. What this means is that for all of these businesses and agriculture and dairy alongside that, we're removing barriers for corporations to compete. Ollie told you why removing these really strict product standards mean that you're able to get more new startup businesses over the line. It also means that these corporations are able to get more resources, because we tell you that just because you have an industry in New Zealand doesn't mean they're able to do everything by themselves. They are still reliant on getting resources that they can then shape into whatever their product is, which means when we make that cheaper by lessening restrictions on international trade, they're able to get those resources more cheaply, which means they're able to expand more because they are spending less money. We told you that this expansion leads to more jobs, that this expansion leads to paying their workers higher wages, and I've impacted that out for you. Then just this point on climate change, I think this is they never fully explained to us why agriculture and climate change, one, was an important enough issue that we should care about right now. We're telling you why this has downstream impacts that are very far into the future because we are such a small portion of emissions, but also that New Zealand isn't going to be the country that is the most directly impacted. We have a duty to care about our citizens first. We're not one of those countries on the equator, or we're not one of those poor underdeveloped countries that aren't able to sustain some weather industries. But also we tell you that there is R&D into more sustainable agriculture, things like genetically modifying cows to fart less methane, right? Okay, then for industries that we simply cannot compete in. This looks like tech and clothing that they tell us about. It's actually better now that we are letting international businesses come in because we get better prices, because ultimately the end of the line, the bottom line is we're never going to be able to compete, right? They tell us about subsidies and brain drain, but they never fully mechanized for us why in the decision calculus of those individuals, they would prioritize a small subsidy to work in New Zealand over just the boundless opportunities that are there overseas, the industries that are already developed that are more likely to succeed. There's much more jobs available, even if you can provide a small amount of money, which means for those subsidies to be effective, they need to be incredibly, incredibly large. And know this comes at an opportunity cost because the government only has a certain amount of money to spend. We also tell you that things like tech and clothing are less essential because they're not continuous services. They're things that a lot of people already have and can reuse, as opposed to things like food that are continuous, that people need more every day. That's the comparative advantage we have. We should capitalize on that.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. I'd now like to invite up the third speaker for the occasion.
when we give international companies unique capacity on their side to literally entrench on New Zealand's economy, to not even want to reinvest into this country because they do not think it is worth it, that is the point at which the New Zealand economy suffers, the people suffer. That's the basis on which the negative side loses this debate. Two things I'm going to do in this speech. First, I'm going to prove to you why domestic industry and the people who are like New Zealand people are going to suffer more on their side and are not going to get more things like jobs and fair prices. And next, on why there's just not going to be international investment, but anything that international actors do is going to be bad. Okay, let's start with New Zealand's domestic industry. The first thing that they told us is that climate change is really far away, so the analysis that we gave you on comparative advantage doesn't matter. Two responses to this. First of all, land is just getting more and more messed up. This looks like, a lot of pasture that cows are on, literally getting becoming worse and worse in quality. This looks like this looks like unused farmland just being unusable for a long time. Secondly, other countries are already failing and growing a lot of things in terms of agriculture. This looks like countries literally struggling to grow coffee beans. This looks like countries literally struggling to grow cocoa beans. Given that other countries are already starting to fail in the agricultural industries, a country so dependent on agriculture like New Zealand is likely to fail too in the future. Okay, next on the stuff that they told us about how New Zealand has a comparative advantage in tourism. Okay, a couple things. First, in terms of the things that attract people to New Zealand. One thing that attracts New Zealand is skiing, right? Note that a lot of New Zealand's snowfall is literally decreasing year after year. That means that people are less incentivized to come to New Zealand on that front. But also on natural nature stuff. Note that first of all, New Zealand is getting dry. New Zealand is getting dry. The natural environment is literally getting worse and worse. It is becoming less and less appealing for tourists to come. I think that's a clear advantage for how climate change is literally harming our most advantaged industries. The next thing they told us is that we can't reallocate money because of New Zealand's debt. First of all, this debate doesn't take place if we cannot reallocate funds, because in the motion it literally states that it is an example is reinvesting into certain industries. But second of all, New Zealand's industries are also the agricultural industry is also reliant on government subsidies. We can easily reallocate those subsidies into things like technology that allows for also better domestic industry growth. Next, on how they told us that domestic industries will grow, and that's really good. Okay, I don't think this is true, because first of all, they're very likely to get outcompeted by MNCs. If we have a New Zealand clothing company that is manufactured in New Zealand, and then you have 20 MNCs that sell the same thing for $1, people are more likely to buy from there, and domestic industry literally cannot grow on their side. And note that we get more growth on our side because there is objectively less competition, especially competition that charges such low prices that they cannot compete. But also there's more specialization, which means that we can have more specialized industries that have better that can lower production costs, that can get themselves out there, that gives us a lot more money to work with. Even if they do have growth, I think that we have more growth on our side because less direct competition means that there is less incentive to constantly be decreasing prices in order to accommodate and in order to compete with these MNCs and lowering profit margins, less money to develop their industry. But also specialization is better than wishy-washy investment that they get on their side when you're trying to invest in loads of different industries are trying to self-sustain, because there's higher capacity to compete globally. Next, on how they get more jobs. I don't think this is true. First of all, the dairy stuff is dairy jobs are broadly symmetric for two reasons. First of all, the dairy industry is moving to automation. It means that you're not going to get more jobs on that front. But second of all, they literally do not need more workers. They're already fulfilling the requirements that they need for exportation. But also, it is literally going to raise production costs if they employ more people, and that is literally for marginal return. Okay, why are there more jobs on our side? There's more jobs on our side because first of all, technology and other industries is literally a fully new sphere of specialization. That means there's jobs for people in things like computer science, electrical engineering, anything technology-based that previously was unable to get jobs. Note that unemployment rate in these, for people who are in these specializations is really high because loads of people go into the degrees due to the emerging industry, but then again, there is a low demand for these jobs because it is still emerging. That means that even if they have more jobs, we can match that level of employment, if not exceed it. Next, just on consumer confidence. Okay, a couple responses to this. First of all, people are more likely to be confident in the economy when they know that New Zealand is prepared for another recession. That is, that on their side, there's a higher perception of an unstable economy because you don't know when a recession is going to hit and when that is going to uproot your life. Furthermore, they gave us the example of how Labour is focused on the Labour Party was focused on resilient economic. Note that this is very different policy. Labour didn't try to shift all of its specialization into technology. I think that's completely out of the scope of this debate. You can easily market at it differently. But next, on like spending, note that we have more spending on our side just because people have more money. And if they have more money from the jobs that they have, they're more likely to have spending and just like increase stimulation of the economy and increase like consumer confidence. And then finally, just on like lower prices. Note that I don't think this is important because it's a very marginal shift. Why is it the case? Note that the New Zealand government has an incentive to not subsidize, but somewhat pay for these like imported products. This looks like using money from like tariffs due to protectionism. This looks like money from consumer spending that goes back to the government. Even if there are higher prices, two reasons why I don't think that actually matters. First of all, the New Zealand government has higher capacity to instill welfare programs that give people the capacity to buy a lot of these everyday things. Because, there's an incentive because, our lower income people need to have support in order to buy like essential goods. But also, more people have jobs, so they're just more likely to be able to afford things because instead of being unemployed with a computer science degree, you are employed with a computer science degree and you are able to buy things. What have I proven to you at the end of this point? I've proven to you why there's literally less domestic growth on their side, and why domestic industries are literally outcompeted by MNCs, and why there is going to be significantly less employment and prices don't actually matter. The impact of this is that people literally struggle to put food on the table more because there's so many more unemployed people. Consumers are less confident and therefore they want to spend less, leading to literally recessions because people have like no more trust in their economy. What this means at the end of this debate is I think this is the most important because it impacts all of our ground level workers. So on scale, you should care about this more because it impacts so many more people. On depth, this is the difference between employment and unemployment. I think we can easily win in this material. I'll take a point now.
We gave you a ton of benefits at first, but even if you don't believe all of them, the MNCs must still at least hire employees, which is
I'm about to move on to
beneficial given the huge increase in cyclical unemployment. Given that, how can you insert that MNCs are so bad?
I'm about to move on to that. Thank you for the POI. Okay, next, moving on to international investment and MNCs. The first thing that the first thing is just about like MNCs just coming into New Zealand and like investing in the country. Two reasons why I don't think that's true. First of all, dairy sucks, so there's less incentive for like things like FDI because it is an unstable industry. It is very volatile. It is very susceptible to being like just completely uprooted as a result of climate change. Second, there's going to be marginal returns. New Zealand is a pretty developed country. That means that there's not going to be that much return on investment. Jamie sort of already explained that to you in his speech. This means that there isn't any new capacity to develop if people that means at best there is a little bit of investment that gives them like marginally more capacity to develop, but in the most case there is going to be less capacity to develop because there's not going to be more capacity to develop because they don't get more money. Next, on like jobs that you get from like MNCs, I think that these jobs are just bad for two reasons. First, they're less likely to pay their workers a lot because they want to increase profit margins as much as they can, because MNCs typically have the capacity to do that more just due to the fact that they'll have like basically more power over the people who are employed in these jobs. But second, they're less likely to reinvest. They have no reason to care about New Zealand because we're just another factory that they have. We're just another office that they have. That literally means nothing to them. What's more important for them is potentially reinvesting into places that have higher returns, higher profit margins, such as places in the United States. That means that there's no returns, there's no money for people. Next, just at the end of this, I've proven to you why there's going to be no economic growth, thanks to any of the external international actors. Note that this was a lot of their positive material, and if that doesn't stand at the end of this debate, I don't see how they can win. Stand with New Zealand, stand with Affirmative.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I'd now like to invite up the third speaker for the debate.
The affirmative side lost this debate when they rested their entire case on dairy being the only industry that we support on our side of the house. I'll get into why this is so problematic and defeats them later, but first, a few clarifications before moving on to the two primary points of clash that I've recognized in this debate. One of this is the effect that it has on the overall economy, and then second, just New Zealand's reliance and why, how problematic this is, how much New Zealand relies on other country. Okay, first clarification that I think is incredibly important to notice for the rest of the debate. They told us that these subsidies are actually very viable ways for the government to help New Zealand, for example, clothing manufacturers, compete overseas. Why is this simply not true? Well, we told you at second and through a POI that places like India or China or Pakistan have like one, much easier access to resources. They don't have to ship them from overseas to their country to manufacture these things. But second, there is much more plentiful labor and it is also a lot cheaper. So what this means is that the cost of production are much lower than New Zealand, and like New Zealand firms have to pay things like minimum wage and import these materials from overseas. What this looks like is like the subsidy the government has to pay for these businesses to compete is so high that it simply isn't realistic or sustainable in the long run, and it just is a waste of taxpayer money that we can use on solving other problems that are much more pertinent or just on public goods like healthcare or education. This is incredibly important because all of their points about New Zealand companies being able to compete with international corporations is contingent on these subsidies actually being viable and effective, but they simply aren't because of how like insanely expensive they will be. Next, I'm just going to move on to like the effects of people that we put forward and kind of their responses to this, okay? So we told you at Ollie a lot of material about like the benefits this has just on individual people in the form of like jobs, because even our big sectors like dairy or agriculture have skilled and unskilled workers, even on ports and ships moving things overseas, and also overseas companies hiring people as well, okay? It also gives them better access to like goods, including important ones, and so like, you know, that's obviously incredibly beneficial to be able to have clothes or like just important things you need. They told us a couple things on this point. They told us that jobs from these international companies are bad. Why is this like simply unrealistic to assert, especially in New Zealand, okay? The bottom line is their evidence for this was that these companies would pay employees badly or treat them badly. One, I think it's incredibly important to note that New Zealand has like really like strict and good quality rules around minimum wage and how you treat employees. So it's unrealistic to assert that these companies would come here and just mistreat our workers. But also, even if like there is some workplace tension, which I don't think is realistic in New Zealand, particularly realistic or pertinent in New Zealand, they still pay tax which can go into public goods. These are things, like I said, like the medical system and like healthcare, education, things that benefit New Zealanders. So them being present here not only provides jobs and goods that help individuals, but it also just benefits them because public goods are provided. Now to move on to the two primary points of clash, and these are the economic effects and then New Zealand's reliance. Okay, so what did they tell us from the on the economic effects, right? Note that a large portion of their case is strangely rooted in whether or not dairy is the only industry supported. Why is it not the only industry that would be able to survive and have production put into it on our side of the house, okay? One, as we told you at second, there are multiple industries that New Zealand has that are still like viable and able to compete. New Zealand exports things like other agricultural things, right? So these look like other plants. We also just have a general like a largely service-based economy. So this looks like overseas things like financial services and like marketing, things like that we provide overseas, as well as tourism. Also, I think it's important to note that like even if we don't lead the world in some categories, we still do have some viable businesses that do things like engineering and computer science. This means that we still have like some companies there that we can help out or subsidize, or at least won't be like completely ignored. I think that's a completely unrealistic assertion from their side of the house, and I've already proven why the subsidies that they propose will help these firms just simply isn't going to be realistic or viable, okay? So that shows why like they're basing it in dairy just simply doesn't hold up, because there are multiple other things that we export and that production would be put towards on our side of the house. Okay, now let's move into this next point. They told us about climate change. Why is their material on this simply not valid or pertinent to the debate? Okay, first off, we've already told you that like in terms of just like actually stopping climate change or the problem as a whole, New Zealand is a very small percentage of emissions. So what matters is us being able to have economic like return and benefits so that we can actually counter these later, okay? Second, we've also told you at second, and I tell you now, that dairy isn't like hyper reliant on like temperatures and things like that anyway, even if some paddocks are affected. Three, like we prefer defending these industries through like technological advancement and other means to combat climate change instead of putting these super expensive subsidies into businesses to try and compete with overseas competitors that just simply aren't feasible. These subsidies simply do not work. Next, we were told that New Zealand companies just won't be able to compete at all with international things. Okay, why is this not true? We already told you that there are multiple sectors like services, agriculture, and tourism that we compete in. Second, like if we do have firms that at least for New Zealand customers still compete for New Zealanders, we can still like help them, and I mean already they're surviving because they're rooted in New Zealand. And Third, we also just told you that having international corporations here provides good things like services, jobs, and just goods for people to have access to. Now onto another point of theirs, okay? This is the point around brain drain and why we keep people here. So first, I think it's incredibly important to note that the examples they told us of what's being taken out of New Zealand aren't things that like New Zealand outsources particularly much. As far as like engineering companies or construction, things like that, or technology, these aren't things that we export to overseas companies, even in like the status quo. So I think that even if some people leave on an individual basis, we still have New Zealand companies that are providing these services and benefiting from New Zealanders supporting them. I also think that just on the ground, on a basic level, New Zealanders want to support New Zealand economy, like companies. So in situations like this, they'll still take it from those people. So that proves why brain drain actually doesn't help them at all in this situation. And isn't a point that stands for them. We keep people here, and we have all these positive economic effects and individual effects. I'll now take a point before I move on.
There are other protectionist policies such as tariffs and quotas that don't cost money. Why is it going to be that expensive on our side of the house?
Well, I think there's another expense when you put things like that. If you put really harsh tariffs that like severely limit the amount of customers that these important overseas like companies are able to do, they're simply going to leave, and this removes all of the positives we've told you about like more jobs and better access to goods. And also it doesn't even provide like a direct pathway for New Zealand companies to compete. I don't think that is very relevant. Now to move on to the point about New Zealand's reliance on overseas companies. They told us, one, that China is going to fail for all these inevitable reasons. Even if you do believe that, we've given you multiple other like companies and places that we get things from for mass manufacturing or clothing or food. These are like India, Indonesia, the US, Pakistan. There are other options here. So resting a large amount of their case on why New Zealand has to have alternate ways to produce goods on China just simply doesn't help them and doesn't hold up. Next, all of their material about like, oh, well, we don't have ways to produce this machinery, we don't have ways to make fuel. This simply is only actually important in like the very worst case scenario. What I think economic shock and supply chain disruptions look like much more realistically are things like when the Suez or Panama Canal get blocked, are things like maybe wars or diplomatic situations that slow down shipping. What I don't think it is like this nigh apocalyptic situation they put forward when New Zealand has to provide everything for itself. I think much more realistically, it looks like price increases, and even if you take that at their best, I think we've given you multiple practical outcomes that outweigh this point. Second, again, they told us that we don't make all they need. But one, I've already told you why things like machinery or like mass manufacturing we can't do efficiently without these crazy expensive and unrealistic subsidies. And so secondly, that means that it's actually just much better to do things like getting free trade agreements so that we can get these things for cheaper instead of trying to produce them ourselves through these expensive subsidies. We may as well just have less restrictions on importing these things for cheaper for our people. And lastly, on this point of clash, we told you that we still have essential services like food, water, or energy. So even in the very worst case scenario, there isn't a massive human cost. The bottom line is we've given you multiple practical benefits for people that look like jobs and more public services and access to goods that help these people on a like individual level. We've also shown why the economy has helped more. And why like the fact that their entire case rests on subsidies just doesn't hold up. Proud to negate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. Now we'll flip speaking orders, and I'd like to invite up the leaders and to the leadership.
There is a reason why Rena from Auckland goes around asking whether we ride sheep to school in the Bay of Plenty. Because it's globally known that our agriculture industry is booming and that our sheep are paying the bills. Nobody talks about how there are more computers or t-shirts than people because New Zealand is just never going to be able to compete with international companies in those industries. Given that we are a stable country with the capacity to be self-reliant in economic shocks, the best way to get our people out of the vulnerable position that we are in, to give them jobs, to pay off our debt, to provide better public services, is to capitalize on our comparative advantages in not only dairy, but other agricultural industries, in tourism, and in our service economy. Then how can we win? Firstly, by proving that efficiency-based economy economic policy, provides economic growth via consumer confidence and business growth, and the downstream effects of this. Or secondly, that our industries are stable enough to cope in economic shocks, that we're not reliant on places like China, so it's a waste of money and resources to implement these resilience policies, and that comes at an opportunity cost. So then, let's start on economic growth. At their best, we hear material about how multinational corporations outcompete and exploit their employees. Note that the large majority of this material did come out at third AF. It's quite late in the debate, but let's take them at their best on there. We think that even if these companies are outcompeting the local businesses, and even if they are exploiting employees, we tell you that they are still paying a large amount of tax to the government, which means that the government is better situated to provide really essential public services into our healthcare system, into our education system that our people really need. We also tell you that even if they are slightly exploitative, or even if they're not paying them well enough, at least they are providing jobs because they still do need workers. They're still hiring people from our country, and a job is really important in terms of how individually you're able to live your life, right? We also tell you this idea of them outcompeting only applies to some industries. It only applies to the industries that they tell you we are not able to compete in, the industries like tech and clothing, right? We still have the better domestic industries in which these multinational corporations are unable to come and outcompete. That is where we want to be capitalizing on, right? But we tell you that they're not likely to exploit their employees anyway, because we have stuff like a minimum wage. So what do we then get at the end of this point of clash? Our material still stands at Ollie about how these businesses, because of this lack of restrictions, are able to get more resources in, that startups are able to develop faster because there's less restrictions, and also that people are able to buy things more cheaply. What we tell you is that this leads to more jobs because these businesses are expanding, and also that people just have more money in their pocket when it comes to when it comes to a struggling situation. This is what needs to be weighed most highly in this debate, because the financial security of having a job, of just having more jobs, having less competition in the job market, is how we reduce the worst harms of the vulnerability that Ollie characterized to you. The worst harms being homelessness, the worst harms being people not being able to pay for healthcare because when they get into a time of hardship, people not being able to send their kids to university and get them to a higher skilled position. Then on this idea of instability and dependency. They tell us that we're reliant on China. I think we were able to sufficiently prove why we have many other places that we go to why we're not just going to crumble because China's economy fails. That's still okay there. Then they tell us that all of our domestic industries are unstable, and that dairy has a lot of problems with the environment, and that I want to note that firstly, all the stuff on why tourism is bad was pretty minimal at best. It came out at third AF. It wasn't sufficient to respond. I think people are still going to come to our country. My material still stands on how we have good natural environments. But in the material on the environment, destroying our agricultural industry, they never actually gave us the mechanistic link for how climate change actually makes agriculture worse. We tell you that it doesn't, because we're not a country that is directly impacted by climate change as much as the ones on the equator. This means that we still can rely on these industries like agriculture. They can still capitalize, they can still slingshot us into a better position as a country.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I'd like to invite up the Affirmative
In what I think was probably my most messy debate of the weekend, I think all of our clashes and all of our burdens kind of got lost in the sauce. In this reply, I'll clear it all up for you. Side negating's trade-off is that they are willing to risk the growth of domestic industries in order to keep costs low. That's something that's specified in the motion. What they need to defend is a policy where the very industries they say should grow are outcompeted by foreign businesses that interest of lower costs. What AF needs to defend then is a world where a level of protectionism means that we're able to develop local industries that we otherwise wouldn't, that would otherwise be outcompeted by other industries. I think that's the big contention in this debate. That's the context on which this debate works. Two things I want to talk about then. First, about whether or not New Zealand comparative advantages are stable, and then second, on economic growth. On whether or not our current comparative advantages are stable, I think there are two broad sectors I want to talk about. Firstly, on agriculture, and then secondly, on like just other industries such as services, such as tourism. On agriculture then, I think it is fundamentally true that we are impacted by climate change to a large degree. Even if our industries aren't impacted by climate change to a large degree though, you still have to buy Jamie's material about how people generically want people to start lowering emissions. That means necessarily reducing our agriculture business in order to try and keep emissions low. That is material we heard from Jamie that wasn't responded to. I think that means even if you do buy the idea that we aren't impacted by climate change directly to a large degree, I think our agriculture industry is still weak on that front. But also just that we have to compare, we have to like have a lot of like equipment that come from outside sources. That is equipment like farming equipment. They say it's a one-time purchase. That's just factually untrue. The point at which, you know, we do have to have like repairs and things. I think that's the point at which there are too much dependency on external supply chains. It means that it is unstable. On other industries then, the ones they say want to grow are things like services, are things like tourism. We've explained, especially with tourism, why climate change still impacts that on that front, how we still have unstable industries. I think that what we need to understand though is things like services are things that still exist on our side of the house, right? Those aren't the startup businesses they are saying want to grow. I'll explain that in our second question. Just note that the weighing on this point is that a large amount of New Zealand economy that is actually relevant, that's actually things that we can control ourselves, are quite unstable, are kind of things that are going to be phased out in the next couple of years. I think it's really important insofar as the people working in these industries are vulnerable individuals. I think the point at which they're at risk of losing their jobs are the point at which the New Zealand government needs to step in and try focus on other industries. Secondly then, on economic growth. The entire negating push was focused on the idea that importing a significant amount of goods would lead to economic growth. That is through things like having lower startup costs because we can import things. That is through things like being able to like have lower barriers and policies that mean that goods don't have to be as good. It's easier to get in the industry. We explained that New Zealand currently gets outcompeted on the global stage. This looks like how multinational corporations outcompete New Zealand businesses and send money away from New Zealand. They said that, they get taxed on that front. That's something that's like new material we got from Luca. I think even if you do buy that, they're still able to get taxed. There's a degree to which money does get siphoned out of the country. Noting that we also told you that imports mean that money literally gets siphoned out of the economy. That's the point at which we give a lot of money to China to purchase a lot of their clothes because we don't develop that on our own. That's the point at which money just leaves our country. Noting that they get these impacts of more jobs when they get more startups, I think they just aren't clear about which startups they actually talk about. Because the point at which they care about having startups, I think it's even better on our side of the house. The point at which we have protectionist policy, that means that we're actually able to start up these businesses. I think that's the point at which we've won this debate, when we're able to block out other industries and tell New Zealanders that they have the capacity to now be able to grow their industries. That's how we actually get the benefits that they claim, about people getting more jobs, about people being able to feed their families and giving the economy more money. I think that honestly, on their front, they just keep sending money out of the country. That's something they necessarily needed to defend. I think for all those reasons, I'm very proud to affirm.